We all know that in aviation, safety is everything. But what happens when, against all odds, things go terribly wrong? We've just seen two incredibly different aircraft in two completely different parts of the world suffer tragic fates. One was a super high-tech jetliner in India, and the other? A simple tourist balloon in Brazil. So today, we're going to dig into the anatomy of how we find answers after an air accident.
And that really is the big question, isn't it? When something awful happens up there, how on earth do we figure out what happened so we can make sure it never happens again? Let's start by taking a look at that first incident.
All right, so our first stop is India. We're talking about an incident that involves one of the most advanced passenger jets flying today. And the timeline here, wow, it is just terrifyingly quick. On June 12th, an Air India Boeing 787 is taking off from Ahmedabad, headed for London. But literally seconds after its wheels leave the ground, there's a distress call. And just minutes later, the crash is confirmed. I mean, it's an unbelievably fast and devastating chain of events.
So, with a machine this complicated, where do you even start looking for answers? Well, investigators have a clear focus. They're looking at the engines, right? Because the initial suspicion is a sudden loss of power. They're checking the flap settings, absolutely critical for takeoff. They're examining the landing gear systems. And of course, the most important piece of the puzzle, those flight recorders, the so-called black boxes, which hold all the data from those critical last moments.
And the response on the ground is just as vital. India's aviation authority didn't wait. As a precaution, they ordered safety checks on every similar aircraft in the entire country. The thinking is pretty simple. If there's a potential problem with one plane, you have to check all of them. It's all about being proactive while the main investigation gets going. Okay, so now let's go from that piece of high-tech machinery to one of the oldest and simplest ways to fly, a tourist hot air balloon in Brazil. The situation is completely different, but you're going to start to see a very familiar pattern emerge. So it's June 21st in Praia Grande. A tourist balloon lifts off for what should be a beautiful scenic ride. But not long after takeoff, the unthinkable happens. Someone spots a fire on board. The pilot tries to get it down for an emergency landing, but it's just too late. A day of joy turns into an absolute tragedy. Now, the investigation here, it looks a lot different, doesn't it? I mean, there are no complex flight recorders to analyze. This is much more fundamental. Investigators are focused on one big question. What started that fire? So they're digging into any possible equipment failures, and really importantly, they're going through all the maintenance records with a fine-tooth comb, looking for any red flags that might have been missed. And what do you know? We see a very similar immediate response. The local authorities in Brazil grounded all other balloon flights in the area. They put everything on pause to review all of their safety procedures. The tech is different, the location is different, but that core safety idea, it's exactly the same. Ground everything first, then figure out what went wrong. Okay, so now's the time to put these two stories right next to each other, because we're looking at completely different technologies, but some very, very similar principles are at work here. I mean, just look at the contrast here. It's pretty wild. In India, you have this massive Boeing 787 on a long-haul international flight. The problem is a suspected power loss, and the investigation is super high-tech, all about flight recorders and engine analysis. Then you jump over to Brazil. It's a small tourist balloon on a short, local trip. The problem is an onboard fire, and the investigation is much more hands-on, focused on physical equipment and paper maintenance logs. They're almost two different worlds of aviation. But here's the thing. For all of those huge differences, the most fundamental response is identical. And this is the key takeaway. No matter what, you investigate what happened right away, and you ground all similar operations to make sure it can't happen again while you look for answers. That simple two-step rule is really the foundation of all aviation safety. And that shared response is no accident. It's actually part of a universal process, a kind of playbook that investigators follow every single time, no matter what kind of aircraft we're talking about. And that playbook is incredibly logical and consistent. Step 1, you lock down the scene and you preserve every single piece of evidence. Then step 2, you start the deep dive, analyzing everything from the flight data to the physical wreckage. All of that work leads to step 3, figuring out the probable cause. And that's not just what happened, but why it happened. And then you get to what is maybe the most important step of all. Step 4, you issue new safety recommendations so that this specific failure can never, ever happen again. And we have to remember, this process, it takes time. In the immediate aftermath, there's always so much speculation. But as the Global Skies Report reminds us, it is so important to wait for the verified official information. The answers will come, but only after every single angle has been looked at. So what's the bottom line here? Whether it's a complex jetliner or a simple balloon, this methodical, relentless search for answers is universal. It doesn't really matter how sophisticated the technology is that gets us into the sky, the human commitment to learning from tragedy is always the same. Which kind of leaves you with a final thought, right? What does this universal quest for safety really tell us about our need to understand, to improve, and ultimately, to protect each other?